Most people today have used quilts before in their life. You may have used one to sit on at a picnic, or maybe you've cuddled up underneath one by a campfire. You may even sleep under one every night. Your mom or grandmother may even have them hanging in their house and have forbidden you to touch them. Perhaps you've even considered buying a handmade quilt online, but then you see the price of them and decide, no way. Well, today I'm going to talk with you about the art of quilt making, which is a brief history of quilting and then the basic steps to making the quilt. Random House Dictionary says that a quilt is a coverlet made of 2 layers of fabric with some sort of substance, maybe wool or filling, between them, and stitched in patterns through all of the thicknesses to prevent the filling from shifting. The actual origin of quilts is unknown, but we do know that the Egyptians used quilting in their clothing and as well as their furniture as far back as the 3400 BC. And we also know that in the Middle Ages, armor was lined with a quilted fabric for the knights. But the earliest surviving quilt was found in the country of Sicily. It dates back to the 14th century, and it is now on display at the Albert and Victoria Museum in London. Listening to her story, A Short Story of Quilting in the U.S., says that the history of quilts in America starts with the very first colonists coming to this continent in the early 1600s, bringing with them the skills and styles of their European homelands. The first quilts were used by colonists for more warmth and functionality. However, after the U.S. became independent, they started to become high-priced luxury items. Starting in the 1700s, quilts became works of art. Materials were imported from England, and creativity and art forms began to flourish. However, when the 1800s rolled around, the use of cotton became very popular for making quilts. Cotton was cheap, and cotton was durable. Creativity did begin to flourish again, and quilting parties became very popular amongst the women. Quilts also became a way of making money for the free person and the slaves during the Civil War. The 1900s switched over from a farm-raised society to an industrial society, and more devices were made to help make quilting easier. But when the Depression rolled around in the 30s, a relearning of hand-stitched quilts became popular. From about 1965 until present day, technology has made quilting a whole lot easier. You now know about the history of a quilt, but now it's time to talk about the fun stuff, the steps to making the quilt. Jen, on her blog, Quilting 101, says, "Quilt making is fun and a rewarding activity that can be enjoyed by people of all ages and skill sets. It's an act of true beauty, and the best part is, once you're finished with it, you get to share it with your friends and family." Step 1, you need to decide whether you're going to make a hand-stitched quilt or a machine-stitched quilt. A hand-stitched quilt is simply done by hand using a needle and thread, and a machine-stitched quilt is done by using some sort of a sewing machine. It can be a basic sewing machine or a long-arm sewing machine. Step 2, you need to gather your ideas and patterns. You can find all sorts of patterns online or in books from the library. There are a few different types of quilts: the whole cloth quilt, the applique quilt, and the patchwork quilt. Here are some pictures of the whole cloth quilt. It's simply putting 2 large pieces of material together and elaborately stitching them. An applique quilt is a patchwork quilt or a whole cloth quilt with some sort of extra decoration appliqued on the top. And a patchwork quilt is a series of triangles and squares and sometimes even circles cut out to make a patchwork style quilt. Some of my favorite patchwork quilts are the log cabin quilt, the bear paws quilt, and the flying geese quilt. Step 3, you need to pick out your fabric. By far, quilter's cotton is the most popular. However, you can use just about any type of material nowadays. Step 4, you need to cut out your fabric according to the pattern. Scissors and templates, rotary mats and rulers and rotary cutters are some great utensils for cutting out the fabric to your quilt. Nancy Purvis says in her book, Quilting from Every Angle, that she likes to use a pin board to help manage and organize her inspirations. Step 5, you need to assemble the quilt blocks. Once all of your pieces have been cut out, then you need to assemble them by sewing them by hand or with the sewing machine. And once all of your quilt blocks have been assembled, then you can move on to step 6, which is assembling the quilt top. Take all of your quilt blocks that you have sewn together and assemble them to make one large quilt top. Step 7, you need to choose the batting and the backing. The batting is the filler in the middle of the quilt. You can use 100% cotton, 100% polyester, and even a blend of the two. Fabric for your backing needs to be selected very carefully because it has to be the width and the length of what your quilt top is. Sometimes you may have to sew material together in order to get the desired width and length. Step number 8 is assemble the quilt sandwich. What I mean by that is taking your backing, your batting, and your quilt top and putting them all together. Jera Brandvig says in her book, Quilt As You Go, that she likes to use blue painter's tape to tape down the backing of her quilt to the floor. So you take your backing, you lay it down on the floor, you pull it taut, and you tape all 4 corners. Step number 2, you lay your batting material on the top of the backing. Step number 3, lay your quilt top on top of those 2 layers. And step number 4, you need to baste them together. I prefer the method of safety pinning, but I also know some quilters who use spray adhesive to baste them together. Once you have put the quilt sandwich together, then it is time to sew the sandwich together. There are 3 methods to quilting. The first method, in the first picture, you can simply use yarn and a needle and just tie your quilt closed. The second one, you can use needle and thread and hand stitch all of the 3 materials together. Or for a quicker and more efficient approach, you can use a sewing machine to close them up together. And then your last and final step is step 10, binding the quilt. You need to have a piece of material that binds all 3 of the quilt pieces together. Some people prefer to go to the store and buy a store-bought brand of quilt binding. Others prefer to use the scraps from their quilt to make their own binding. Some people even use a decorative stitch around the edge of their binding to close the quilt up. Once your quilt has been bound, it is now time to enjoy your hours of hard work or give it to someone else to be treasured for a lifetime. Today I have shared with you some of the history of quilt making as well as the basic steps to quilt making. I hope that through this speech you have a better understanding of just what goes into making a handmade item and an even greater appreciation of the heirloom that may have been passed down to you or that one day you may receive. And perhaps next time you're browsing Pinterest or Etsy and you come across a handmade quilt for an astronomical price, think about all of the hard work and dedication that goes in to making one of these works of the heart. My name is Abigail Blasky. This is my informative speech for CST 110 Online.